Hello and welcome to Keep It Science. I'm Dr. Elisabeth Kugler, a science communicator and your host of today's Keep It Science episode, Keep It Accessible. Accessibility is very close to my heart. For those of you who don't know, I have a rare autoimmune condition, and over the last 4 years, my own life has changed dramatically from being healthy with a career track to becoming a research group leader to someone who's being disabled and spending way too much time in hospital. Today's guest might not be a scientist, but someone who knows all about struggles, strength and adaptability, everything that is required for a perseverance mindset. By sharing our stories today, we hope to share some insights into the need for diversity and accessibility across all industries. Our guest today is Darren Edwards, a former soldier and avid mountaineer, and Darren is a record-breaking British disabled adventurer, inspirational speaker and internationally renowned author. All of that after a climbing accident left him paralyzed from the chest down. So welcome, Darren, and thank you so much for joining me here today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now, despite this unbelievable impact, you've embraced this accident and spinal cord injury, and you have used it as a catalyst for personal growth, showcasing resilience and determination. Your remarkable journey of strength through adversity has inspired so many, myself included, across the globe to overcome obstacles and really find their limits. Darren, you're currently speaking on many radio stations and podcasts, including London Live, TNT Magazine, and even Lad Bible, which is pretty cool. But could you introduce yourself to our listeners who perhaps haven't heard your story yet?
Yeah, I am going to assume that most people haven't heard about me, and I was recently featured in a magazine where they told me that they love to tell the stories of unknown people, and I was like, okay, I won't take that as a dig, thank you very much. But yeah, so I think you've captured it there. You know, I was somebody who, my identity was kind of really built into the mountains and built into climbing and built into being in the great outdoors and kind of pushing myself and sort of seeing what you can achieve with a bit of determination and grit. And then, on a day that kind of resembled a lot that had come before it, I was climbing a rock face near where I live, so just inside North Wales with my best friend. And a section of rock gave way beneath me and sort of, all of a sudden I'm falling from the top of a 250-foot section of this rock face. And, if it wasn't for the actions of my best friend that day, in risking his own life, he stopped me as I sort of hit a ledge at about 35 foot. And he jumped on top of my body, very much putting himself in harm's way because, I could have knocked us both off the ledge. It was no more than 6 foot wide. And it started a completely unexpected, daunting journey that has been, battling back to overcome that kind of darkest moment of your life where you are really struggling to see where the light at the end of the tunnel is, particularly when you're getting told that you've got something called a spinal cord injury, which I had no, prior knowledge of or no prior awareness of. I didn't know anybody that was disabled. I didn't have any friends that were disabled. That's not because I'm a horrible person. It's just because I think statistically most of us probably don't have direct contact with somebody with a spinal injury or with a disability. Well, not that we're aware of anyway. And it's been an incredible 7.5 year journey of rediscovery and of building back from kind of very much the ground up. And, I've gone on to do stuff that I never would have thought possible for somebody with a disability. Gone on to do stuff that I never would have thought in my wildest dreams I would have achieved in my life, regardless of able-bodied or not. Kayaking from Land's End to John O'Groats, running 7 marathons, 787 constant, skiing across an ice cap in Iceland. Kind of experiences that I wouldn't trade for the world, and a life that I now, wouldn't trade for all the money in the world. And, the collections with my friends, with my family, with my partner, my now wife, are that much stronger because of that kind of shared adversity that we've all gone through with my accident. So, yeah. And the book, Strength Through Adversity, I'm not trying to sell it. I'm probably the world's worst salesman, but it is quite literally all of the blogs that I kept while I was in hospital and when I was leaving hospital, and all of the writing that I did just for me, just for my own kind of emotional processing. And who would have thought one day that could all be put into the same document and it would become a book, but it has.
You should be a salesman. The book is absolutely amazing. I loved reading it. And to be honest, I've cried and laughed so much, and sometimes at the same time, because it's so relatable. especially I think if someone is spending time in hospital, and I mean, our illnesses are very different, right? Like for me, it's an autoimmune disease that set on when I was about 30 years, and it was over a few months that I became really ill, and I couldn't, wash my own hair. I couldn't produce any food or anything. I couldn't even work. And I was a lot of time in hospital. But I think even though our kind of diseases and like disabilities are very different, there is so much common ground in how you and I kind of needed to reclaim our lives. And I think reading your book was so impactful because especially, your first recovery time in the hospital is such an important time. And maybe you want to talk a little bit more about, your initial phase of recovery, how that kind of, how you approach it and how your mindset shift in these first few months.
First, I think just to touch on what you said, I completely agree. Whilst our stories are slightly different, they share a kind of key common thread that runs through both of them, which is probably, that I'd certainly took for granted my body until the ability to walk was taken away. I think I would have I don't think I wasted life before my injury because of, all the stuff that I was sort of doing. But at the same time, I didn't realize how special it was just to be able to walk up a mountain if you wanted to. And like you said, when all of that ability is taken away from you, suddenly you can't wash your own hair. It's difficult psychologically. So, and for me, the hardest, it's funny, the start of the journey in hospital and the end of the journey were the hardest points, but for very different reasons. So the start of the journey, it was kind of, you're battling to keep yourself, you're battling to keep your head above water. You're in intensive care, you're surrounded by these machines that are beeping, you're surrounded by screaming patients, and it's a very claustrophobic, and I felt a bit stifled and strangled, and I really struggled in that first week to stop myself from drowning, and that's kind of how I was perceiving it. And particularly when, the day after my accident, when I've kind of just recovered from like a 9-hour surgery, and I'm kind of just regaining consciousness, and there's a surgeon at the end of the bed, and he kind of does what a surgeon does, which is give it to you in very black and white clinical terms. There's no sugarcoating of it. And I remember him saying that, as I'd landed, I'd broken my back into 2 pieces, I'd severed my spinal cord at T6, and that meant that categorically, I would be paralyzed from the chest down for the rest of my life. And no matter how hard I tried, there would never be the ability to walk again. And I know why he was telling me that, but it really hurt, because I think he was trying to make it clear that, there was no point hanging on for something that was never going to happen, and living in hope that one day I might wake up and suddenly be able to move my feet or my legs, But what he did say, which was really powerful, that at the time I didn't really appreciate what he was telling me, but he said that the key difference in this moment is to be able to look forward and to not look back. And I think, that resonated a few weeks later when I'd had a bit more time to think about what he told me, which is, it is about that ability to look to the future and not to look back at the past and kind of try and fixate on something that you're never going to get back to, because as much as you look over your shoulder, you'll never be able to be there again. But, ahead of you are doors that are open, ahead of you is opportunity that was never there before, perhaps. So, it's not about trying to bounce back and to be the person that you were yesterday. It's about bouncing forward and trying to be a better version of yourself, even if those opportunities look different to what they did, a day or 2 days prior. So, intensive care was really difficult, but then it was actually a kind of a long, slow slog of rehab, where you're kind of week by week, you do feel a bit more resilient, and week by week, you do feel a bit more like you're getting a handle on it. And 4 months in, I'm a matter of weeks from being discharged, and I'm kind of hitting all of the stuff that I need to do. And the rehab process for somebody who likes to feel like they're taking charge and physically making a difference is quite good, because you're given a series of tests that you have to pass and a series of markers that you have to hit. And that kind of spoke to the climber in me, that kind of you have that gradual evolution of your ability, where one day you can't climb a very particular grade and the next day you can. So there's a lot of positive growth in those first 4.5 months, and a lot of resilience that's being built. And then it's when the girl that I thought I was going to marry, and the girl that I thought was, you know, the one, if we want to give it that term, came onto the ward and kind of through a flood of tears told me that she couldn't be with me anymore and didn't see how we would make our relationship work on the outside world, and you know, that she was really sorry and she couldn't do it. And I remember kind of like sitting there frozen to the spot, dumbstruck, shocked and heartbroken as she kind of stood up and walked out through the double doors. And I never, you know, saw that person again. And that was probably the real rock bottom, because all of a sudden I think I was hit by the enormity of not just the heartbreak, but of having a disability and being alone. Not that I was alone, because I had friends and family around me, but in that moment I felt very alone and very unlovable. And that was the darkest moment for me. But it was against that kind of period, you know, of hurt, where Kate, one of the physios I'd worked with every day for the last 4 months, came in and everybody knew what had happened. You can't keep things secret on that kind of ward because you live there, you know, and everybody's your family there. And Kate kind of came up to my bed space and she kind of like peered around that blue curtain that I'd put around my bed, and I was just shutting the world out. And she kind of came in and she said, look, I know that things hurt right now and things are difficult, but thing that I notice that makes a difference between who goes on to do something and achieve something when they leave this place and those that don't, is the ability to look to the future and come up with a kind of concept of who you want to be, who you're aspiring to be. So she said, do me a favor, think 4 years in the future and think about the man that Darren Edwards goes on to become, and be bold, be aspirational with it. And I want you to tell me what he went on to do from right here, right now, heartbroken and feeling alone. And I want you to retrace his steps back to this moment. And when I leave, I want you to take the first tiny step forward. And, you know, I had enough respect for Kate because of, you know, the fact she'd been there for me from, you know, the hardest day to this point. And I kind of thought, okay. So came up with this idea of, right, in 4 years, this is where I want to be. And in my head, I wanted to be at the Paralympic Games because I'd watched the Paralympics on TV while I was a patient. And I kind of thought, well, what a turnaround to be at the Paralympics in 4 years as an athlete. And I called up Matt and I said, look, there's something I need you to come and do and help me with. And I don't want you to question it. I just want you to support me. And the next day he turns up at hospital and we drive to Manchester, 2 hours away, and I buy a kayak, a sea kayak at a kayak shop. I've never kayaked in my life. I had no idea whether somebody with no core function or leg function could kayak, but I was determined that I would make it, you know, work. And that was the start. So yeah, I've rambled there for probably 5 minutes, but I think the point I was trying to make is that sometimes it's the things that other people say that have the impact, you know, the ability to look forward and not look back, and the ability to shoot for a future aspirational version of yourself and not get caught up in how you feel right now, because we all have apprehension and anxiety that can hold us back from the world and can cause us to push the world away, which is what I was doing, you know, in the aftermath of that relationship falling apart.
And I think especially, you know, you talking about the nurses, as you know, you can't keep anything from them. They become your besties, your second family. They know everything. And I love that. So a big shout out to all the NHS nurses and healthcare team. But I also want to kind of very briefly refer to what you mentioned a few minutes ago, which was the feeling of drowning. Because for me, it was very different. So I became ill in 2020. And then in 2021, I was actually diagnosed. But between that time of becoming ill and my diagnosis of autoimmune disease, I very rapidly declined. So my lung function, my muscles, etc., declined very rapidly, and I became really, really ill and spent a lot of time in hospital. And I think for me, this first time was just so intense because I was healthy before, and then suddenly I was like 56 days in hospital in 2021, and then I had 188 appointments in that year. So on average, like 3 different appointments, be it physio or, you know, a scan or therapy or whatnot. And for me, it was so intense that I felt like I didn't even have the time to think.
Yeah.
And it was only after this initial kind of first year that I had this feeling of drowning. And I felt like, you know, everything was around, you know, your medication, you're not being exposed to, especially COVID at that time because I was immunocompromised. And everything was just around being ill. And I felt only then, like about a year later, when I then kind of stabilized, that I felt more like the main thing that I really grieved was not, what could have been, but really also the person that I was at that time. Because obviously everything changes, like my career, my physical appearance, the abilities that we have, and everything, when you look in a mirror. So I thought your feeling of drowning for me came later, if that makes sense.
That speaks to the difference, but also the similarities of our experiences, I think. That they are two very distinct life experiences that you wouldn't sign up for. But probably it's very similar lessons learned. In terms of that ability to reframe. I always remember 2 weeks after like that day happened, somebody showed me a picture that had turned up on Twitter the day of my accident, and it had been taken from the roadside, looking up at the cliff above, and you could just about make out these tiny red dots about 3/4 of the way up this this cliff. And that really hit home for me that was me, and that was these people around me. And that single picture helped me to reframe the way I look at it. And I appreciate it's probably different for your experience, because, nobody could show you an image that really encapsulated why you were lucky. Whereas for me, there was quite literal physical evidence of the fact that I had nothing to complain about, because it could have been so much worse.
No, I know what you mean. For me, it's probably more like the, obviously each case is different and each patient is different. But for me, it was mainly like the healthcare team that we have is a very specialized healthcare team. And it's in Leeds. And, obviously we drive over an hour to the hospital, etc. But they are so exceptional and so specialized that as soon as I spoke with them for the first time, I felt like this is my lucky ticket, right?
Yeah.
Because I knew they were so specialized, they knew what they were talking about, and I knew I had a chance of surviving. Yeah. So I think that was that for me, where I was like, oh yes, this is going to work, hopefully. I'm going to stick around for a while longer, definitely. But I think it's also one thing that you spoke about was obviously relationships, right? And I know I'm jumping a little bit back and forth, but I think it's so important to also kind of come back to that, because obviously we have all like a huge network of healthcare and family and friends, but I think a partner has a very different role in this situation.
Yeah, for sure. I think I completely agree. And it's because you can't help but project a little bit of what you're going through onto them. And also, I think your partner forms such a big part of that vision of the future. And that's probably why it hurt so much for me, was because I saw this image of me and this person, like, defying the odds and doing all of these things as this incredible couple that didn't get stopped by a disability. And then it really hit home that we were just we were a statistic as one of the couples that didn't survive. And also, like, probably, it really made me think, well, if this person can't love me for who I am, then who's going to now? And that's why I'm so grateful, and I don't take for granted my wife, TJ now, who, loves me for who I am, regardless of whether I stand or I sit. And, together we have what I'd hoped for the other relationship, which was to do all of these amazing things that kind of go beyond and transcend disability. And I think, knowing you personally, we're both very lucky that we're with people that love us for who we are and are there by our side to pull us through those difficult moments.
Yeah, I have to say, so my partner, he was definitely so positive, and I hate him sometimes for how positive he was. So again, we mentioned your book earlier, but I think you mentioned you wrote it as blogs. Yeah. They like this reflection and this writing. How did that help you? I'm really keen to hear a little bit more about that.
So that was on the recommendation of the hospital psychologist. So you kind of had these weekly catch-ups, because they're essentially trying to help you process the trauma and to avoid because I think PTSD is something that they see on quite a regular basis. the majority of people on that ward have been injured in some form of, some people are there for spinal strokes and for kind of quite, I say mundane very carefully, but quite mundane reasons, compared to a car crash or a motorbike crash or a climbing accident or a BMX or mountain biking accident. There are some people there that woke up paralyzed, which is flipping scary as hell, but like it happens. So they're trying to help everybody process their trauma. And I remember the first meeting I had with this lady, she kind of said, how are you processing your feelings? And I was like, what do you mean? And she was like, well, how are you processing your thoughts of that day? Because I was conscious for the whole thing. And I was like, I'm choosing not to think about it. And she was like, oh, so you'd say you're boxing it and putting it to the back of your mind? And I was like, yep, that is exactly what I'm doing. And she was like, okay, I'm going to tell you why that's not a good idea. And obviously, now I look back, the obvious truth is that boxing things up and trying to put it away at the back of the mind and not explore it and not process it is just a one-way ticket to one day being hit by a truckload of, flashbacks and unseated, trauma that you haven't processed healthily up front. I think these things have to hurt up front for the long-term gain. And she kind of said to me, look, do me a favor. Next time we have one of these meetings, I want you to have done one of these things. I want you to start writing about the day of your accident. She said, I don't care what you do with it. Write it, keep it to yourself, write it, throw it in the bin, write it, put it on a blog. Just write and get your thoughts, your feelings and your emotions out. And she was like, or talk to somebody. And if you don't want to talk to somebody, write it. And I didn't feel like talking because I didn't want to cry in front of anybody. I don't know. I didn't know how I would feel once I started talking about that moment. So I started to write about it, and it was painful. It was difficult, and I had to stop every now and then and kind of like come back to it an hour or a day later, because I'd got to a point where I knew that in the story of what happened that day, this was going to be a really painful bit to write about. But I remember the feeling of finishing the first, what would become a blog, which wasn't intended to be a blog, of that day of my accident. And I felt like a massive weight had been lifted off my shoulders. And I put it online. I made a blog called Strength Through Adversity. So you see where the book title comes from. That title came from one of my friends that recommended. He was like, oh yeah, Strength Through Adversity is cool. And I was like, oh sweet. So I took that. And I kept writing, and I wrote about everything up until about the 2-year mark, when I felt like I didn't need to write anymore. I felt like I'd processed everything. I'd got over the heartbreak of the relationship. I'd met TJ. Things were in a really good place, and I kind of realized that I was healed. I felt like I didn't need to write anymore to just maintain balance. I felt okay.
I think it's really good to talk about that as well, to say like there is, ways to overcome that change and overcome these losses and trauma. And that can be writing or talking about things. So that's really good. But before we move any further onto a slightly more science-oriented topic and talking about accessibility, we'll just have a quick word from another podcast. Science.
What is it?
Who does it?
Why does it matter?
The Science Night podcast answers these questions by giving scientists a place to tell their story.
We also highlight science news and discoveries that will have you asking, my God, what have I done?
What weird thing are we going to talk about this week that involves a frog?
They made an organic robot? Didn't they see The Matrix?
Join us every other Friday, wherever you get podcasts, and at SciNight.com.
So now obviously you have turned your blogs into a book. So what's your plans with the book and talking about the book and all your speeches and keynotes that you're giving at the moment?
So what I enjoy about life now, and why I feel like life's gone full circle, is like where things were before my accident. I was just about to start, teaching history. I was kind of wanting to do that because I wanted to have an impact on people. And we all remember like the teacher that gave a crap at school, the teacher that kind of made things come alive and inspired you. So the reason I wanted to teach was to kind of like to give a bit of that back and to be that person that cares about, said student and says like, that you can achieve more if you just put the right mindset to it. So actually now with the whole speaking thing, that's kind of what I feel like I'm getting to do, but in a more probably impactful way, because we're not talking about the subject of history. We're talking about the subject of overcoming challenges and adapting and evolving as a person. And, there are things that I'll have learned and you will have learned because of our experiences that had life been all rosebuds and, sweet, we never would have learned, because I think it's only when you put through the storm that you kind of really find out how to navigate, to use that kind of expression. And so for me, the speaking stuff, it pays the bills, but the motive behind why I do it isn't anything to do with money. It's to do with changing people's mindsets and having a positive impact on the next time somebody, and you never know what people are going through in a room. I started speaking after my first big expedition where we kayaked from Land's End to John O'Groats, and I kept turning down opportunities to speak because I didn't have an interest in being the center of attention and having people kind of scrutinize what I was doing or saying. And then my dad, and I think this touches on another subject entirely, but my dad took his own. So my dad struggled with his mental health and depression, and sadly took his own life 2.5 years ago. And it was actually going through that as a family and going through that as a son that was the kind of real final kick up the arse to actually get out there and start speaking about my own journey, because I felt like had someone spoken to Dad, before it was too late, something that they said might have resonated and might have helped him to think differently. So for me, a lot of why I speak is to try and share some of those lessons in the hope that one day somebody in the room, is going through that kind of battle, and something I say does help. And I think a year after I first started speaking, I did a talk for Huel. They invited me into the headquarters. I did a talk for them, and then someone came up to me. I won't say whether it was male or female, but they came up and said, look, I've really been struggling with my mental health, and I've been thinking that I don't want to be here anymore. And I just wanted to say thank you, because you've made me think a bit differently. And I remember getting into my car and just bursting into tears, because why I started speaking, this was the exact reason. And I felt like, that was the real purpose and the real reward behind speaking. So there is no plan for the book or for speaking, apart from to try and speak and, touch as many people as possible, and to help as many people as possible. And that's the main vision for the next probably 5-10 years is developing this adaptive expeditions charity that I set up with 2 really close friends earlier this year, because, it's been access to adventure and expeditions that have changed the way I see myself. Without the opportunities I've had in the last 3 years, I'm not sure I would have ever got to the point where I am now, which is, with access to a time machine, I wouldn't go back. Whereas 3 years ago, I would have, snapped your hand off for that opportunity. So the plan, and there is a plan for adaptive expeditions, is to grow over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years to develop a community of adaptive adventurers in the UK from the broadest spectrum of disability and injury, and giving these people the kind of opportunities that I've had. Some of that will be, mini expedition style stuff that will still be the first time someone's got out and camped or paddled or cycled since their injury, or whatever it is that's happened to them. And some stuff will be big things, big expeditions that really are quite groundbreaking and challenge the perception of what, being disabled means and is. So there's a plan behind that, because I think, that has the potential to make a really big impact on lots of people in our kind of situation, where something's changed or they've been born with something that they wouldn't have necessarily signed up for.
Absolutely. So firstly, I'm sorry to hear about your dad, and really huge thanks for sharing all these insights. I also love the word storm that you used, going through the storm, because like I said, I started to write my story now, and the kind of working title is literally Beyond the Storm. You go through it and, you don't see the end of it, but one day things kind of hopefully turn out to be better. But also, obviously sharing things many people go through, a lot of things that no one talks about. And I think one thing that really struck with me when you and I spoke before, you asked me, if really I felt like I was stronger after this experience. And I thought about it so much. And I think my initial reaction was like, oh, yeah, sure. Because that was kind of my first gut feeling. But I think the more I think about it, I think for me personally, I think it wasn't the strength that I felt, but it was much more like gratitude and humility and, these little things for like, I can be ridiculously happy about a cup of coffee now. I know it sounds like nothing, but it's like the fact that I still breathe and I'm still here is just huge. And also these expeditions that you plan, it's so impactful. Like you say, a lot of people, they might not have even left the house for weeks on end because they can't physically do things anymore. Yeah. I think especially, going on a kayak in a river with other people can be so inspirational.
Yeah, and I think not everybody has that network around them that kind of say, why not? And how can we? And, had I not been surrounded by those type of people, my journey would be very different. We probably wouldn't be having this conversation today. So, what we're trying to be as Adaptive Expeditions is that support network, is that support mechanism. And I would argue that even though you may not perceive it as strength, I would say being grateful and being humble is strength. So you're probably you're being overly humble, actually, there, overly modest.
God bless you. Moving on from this, accessibility. Obviously, this podcast is called Keep It Accessible. So yeah. I just want to talk a little bit about like also the experiences in sciences, and kind of I was a scientist when I became ill, and then I would love to hear a little bit more about your experiences with accessibility. So for me personally, I worked in a lab when I got ill, and it was really strange because obviously COVID happened, right? And everyone was starting to work from home, and so all the work changed anyways, and everything was a little bit up in the air. But I think for me, the biggest change was really my occupational therapist. So I had a phone call with her, and we spoke for about, I think it was 3 hours, the first phone call. It was about everything, from, I couldn't wash my hair or prepare food to, getting an additional banister on the stairs so I would be able to actually walk up and down, with a little bit of support, all these little things. And I think so for me, the occupational therapist was the most important person to have a more accessible life and a more, life with the quality that I wanted to live. But also for me, my employer was really important. So I worked at UCL at that point, and I had a really great supervisor and a team at UCL, and the charity who actually funded my work, which is Moorfields Eye Charity. They were amazing. They were so open-minded, and I felt not fully comfortable with talking to everyone, but for me, it was always important to be very honest and say, I haven't chosen this, but I would love to still work with you in a capacity that I can. Mm-hmm. And so they completely changed my whole project from being in the lab to then work remotely from home. And, I learned about reasonable adjustments and what that means and all these good things. And it was really difficult as well. Like, obviously, again, I didn't even have the vocabulary because I didn't know, like what was an occupational therapist or reasonable adjustments, all these good things. So it was a huge learning experience. So I would love to also hear from you what kind of your experiences, what is it like that made your life more accessible, and what was like the thing that had the biggest impact for you and how you started to live your new life?
Yeah. So I think for me, obviously, I was just about to start that career change, and whilst I couldn't start that career, they were kind of saying, look, when you're ready, we will make every adjustment we can to welcome you. The job that I hadn't, that I was literally on my notice and 2 weeks from leaving when I had my accident, then said, look, when you're ready, there is a job for you to come back to. So if you want to. And for me, like returning to the world of work was returning to normality. And I know that I needed to probably push myself to go back as soon as I could, because I didn't want it to be like this elusive, intimidating prospect. So, I think the month after I was out of hospital, I was starting to transition back into work. And a bit like you, they were, willing to make any kind of reasonable adjustments, and access to work is a scheme in the UK whereby, I had a standing desk. So they bought me a standing desk and a standing wheelchair. So it's a wheelchair with two handles on it, a bit like your car boot lid, to put it very plainly. And, you have a brace at the knees and you push up on these handles, and all of a sudden you're stood back up, because for a wheelchair user or a spinal cord injury person, you need to stand up at least 5 times a week for over half an hour to kind of get the health benefits. So at home, I've got a standing frame that I stand up in every day for about an hour just to enjoy it. I enjoy being back at 6 foot and standing up. So work were kind of like over accommodating in terms of what they could change. I think luckily being local government, they kind of have to be. But then again, I guess I've seen examples of great and I've seen examples of awful. Unfortunately, the examples of awful accessibility kind of seem to revolve around transport. You get kind of stories of people, well, I've been on a train and you get to a platform and there's no ramp as promised, and you're suddenly stuck on a train that you then can't get off at your station. So that's probably why I drive as much as I do, because you can just have a bit more control. Flights, you hear people that, get to the other end of their flight and their wheelchairs still at the other airport, and that's happened. I've had a turn up in Dubai for a training camp ahead of the World Marathon Challenge, and my wheelchair was bent in a shape that I couldn't quite recognize. And I was looking at it thinking like, that doesn't look right. And it kind of kept wanting to do a front roll as opposed to keeping me stable. So, these things happen. I think there's brilliant progress. You can't be in a Western country and complain too much, because it's so much more progressed than it is in wherever I experienced that's a bit behind, probably the Middle East. But then again, Dubai, they've rebranded disability as person of determination, which I quite liked. But London, as an example, London is a historic city. And I think part of the trade-off of having all that history is that some of the buildings are quite inaccessible, and, you can't blame them for building something the way they did 300 or 200 years ago. But I do see it as something that is progressing. It's something that's getting better. I think disability is more visual and evident than it ever used to be. And I think the kind of like the narrative is changing for the better, which is driving places to be more accessible. I was on the phone I'm doing a talk for Skyscanner in May, in a couple of weeks' time. And at the end of the kind of briefing call, they were saying, while you're down at the office, do you mind if we could tap your brains a little bit about, from a booking perspective, how things could be more evidently accessible? So companies are thinking like that, and companies are thinking that they need to evolve and improve to make things more, empowering for somebody with a disability. And I think that's brilliant. So yeah, there are some negative experiences, but more than anything else, I think there is a real positive conversation about, how do we make things more accessible?
And it's wonderful to hear that Skyscanner is asking you, as a person who has this experience of like what works and what doesn't work, to really speak with them and say, have you thought about X, Y, and Z? Because often it's these little things of just having a person rather than a computer ask you about your accessibility needs, right? So one really important thing that I really wanted to get to as well is obviously the wider impact and your message to others. You work so much in speaking to companies, having a real impact with people and sharing your experience. But I think the most important person I could think about is like the person who literally just had a spinal cord injury. And what would your message be to someone who is literally in hospital right now and they can't see this end of the tunnel or beyond the storm, and they're literally in hospital? What would you say to them if you could?
Yeah, so I went in to see a young guy 2 weeks ago who's 26. So he's actually the same age I was when I had my accident. And one of the things that I enjoy getting to do the most is to go in and kind of, speak to these people when they're going through exactly what you've just described, those kind of emotions of what the hell is ahead of me type thing. Because I remember how many negative stories I heard from old patients that had maybe been injured 10, 20, 30 years ago when the landscape was different. And they painted a very dire picture of what life was going to be like. And I remember kind of like quite stubbornly, defiantly thinking that they were wrong, even though I had no experience of what life with the spinal injury was going to be like. But I think I've turned out to be the correct one. Like I've turned out that life has been, what I was sort of holding on to hope that it could be. And I get asked to go in every now and then to meet like people that are going through it. I went in to meet somebody who was 17 years old a couple of months ago. And, that the story and the message to them is that it's not the end. It's the start of an unexpected journey, and one that you probably right now wouldn't ask for. And certainly I wouldn't have asked for it at the time. But there is so much opportunity. There is so much that you can't quite see right now. And, when you're like to use the storm analogy again, when you're in the middle of, strong winds and darkness, it is quite hard to see the horizon, and you don't know where your balance is coming from, and you don't know where your direction is going to come from. But when you start to push through that storm a little bit, you get closer to the kind of calm on the edge. And I think that's kind of why I've set up adaptive expeditions as well, is because, the guy that I went to see 2 weeks ago, I was like, look, you had a mountain biking accident. You're an active, outdoors, adventurous person, and there's no reason why your future doesn't include all of those elements in it. And when you're ready, we're here. When you're ready, I'll be there to sort of, sit beside you as you take on a small, medium, or big size adventure you pick, and it's all about just changing. We say about like challenging the perception of disability from the able-bodied community, but it's also challenging the perception of what being disabled means to the person that's going through it right now and is living week 2 of this new existence type thing. So it's not the end, it's the start. I think that's probably the key message, really. And it's not the start of a lesser journey, it's the start of a different one, but one that has probably opened doors that were never open to you before. You just don't see it yet.
Yes, absolutely. And I also think like life becomes richer in so many other ways. It's often, like I said, for me, it's the little things now that I'm so elated about, where, I never took a second thought about them in the past, but now I'm absolutely, thankful for everything. Maybe as a last question as well, obviously, most of our listeners are in kind of the scientific and academic field, and we spoke a little bit about, accessibility and your advice to companies. Could you share a few thoughts on like what could universities or companies in general maybe do to improve the accessibility? Maybe just like a thought or two on, a general, what would be your ideal plan?
Oh, so this is a tangent to, it's related to the scientific community. So I'm an ambassador for Wings for Life. So Wings for Life is a charity that's set up by Red Bull that funds, I think, currently 180 research projects around the world. So you've got scientists around the world looking at what is a cure for spinal cord injury, or to improve certain outcomes within kind of, spinal cord injury. You've got the ability to walk or not walk. You've got no control of your bladder, no control of your bowels. Sexual function is altered, obviously. So there are scientists around the world working on Wings for Life projects that are looking at various elements of that kind of conundrum. And some are looking for the silver bullet, which is kind of how do you bypass the break in a spinal cord, or how do you heal, the cells within a spinal cord. And there's been some like incredible results. And every year they bring research projects from around the world together in Austria, and they present to each other to make sure there's no duplication, make sure that there's joined up thinking. And I think at the conference last year, they said for the first time in history, they're confident that in the next 10 years, there will be, a significant, they didn't say a cure, but they said a significant breakthrough. And there's been a project in Austria that's had somebody at the same injury type of me walk again with electrodes for the first time in like 10 years, I think, for him. So my my shout out to the scientific community listening is to get involved and to help. Not for me, but for the future version of me, male or female, that needs your help. So, do that and I'll be grateful. Thank you very much. I'd also, I guess, from an accessibility point of view, from a university or from a sort of scientific perspective, it's funny that the ability to walk seems to be perceived as the main thing. Whereas, for a lot of people, actually, it's the stuff that you don't see that represents the biggest challenge. So for me, walking, I've adapted to not do, and I live a really fulfilling, happy, purposeful, adventurous life without the ability to walk. What has been the most frustrating has been, me and TJ, my wife, have been sort of, on an IVF and baby journey for the last 2.5 years. And it's actually the ability to not have a baby naturally, and hence why we have to use IVF, that can be the most frustrating. So I think it's just that awareness piece that, somebody in a wheelchair, it's not actually perhaps necessarily the biggest challenge, the fact they're in a wheelchair. And also, an expression that I really hate hearing, and to end on a negative, is when people say good for you. I don't know if you've ever got that. People go, good for you. Oh, yeah. It's the most patronising, flipping thing you could ever be told. So never say good for you to somebody in a wheelchair. It just pees them off. But apart from that negative note, it's all been a very positive interview. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I've got so many more things that I would love to talk with you about. And I think for me, the thing that I absolutely hate is when people say like, oh, I hope you get better soon. And it's like an incurable disease. And you're like, thanks, cheers for that. So yeah, absolutely. Darren, thank you so, so much. It's been so insightful, and obviously best of luck for your trip. And I will not say good for you.
Yeah, good for you.
Good for you. But thank you so, so much. We really cannot wait. What is next?
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. Been a pleasure.
It's been potentially the most personally meaningful and honest discussion about setbacks, strength and adaptability. And we really appreciate you taking the time to having a chat to us, and really sharing all your insight and experiences. Our next episode will be our final episode of season 1, in which Nick and I, maybe some words from our special guest, will round up what we've learned and what we can take away from this toolkit of knowledge. We will also be talking about what you can look forward to in season 2. That's right, we will have a very short break over the summer, and we are happy to announce that we will be back with much more great content. If you would like to be involved or have any questions for us or our future guests, please contact us on platforms such as formerly known as Twitter or LinkedIn at Keep It Science. But you can also email us any questions that you have at keepitscience@gmail.com. Also make sure to follow Nick and myself on LinkedIn and Twitter so we can connect with you and talk about any science-related topics. Finally, you can listen to more from us on Google, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or wherever you're listening to this right now. So for the penultimate time this season, keep learning, keep it accessible, and keep it science.
This episode was sponsored by Darren Edwards, disabled adventurer and inspirational speaker. Darren has redefined the limits of what is thought possible for an individual with a spinal cord injury, and we've been incredibly moved and inspired by his story. If you want to learn more about Darren's incredible story, you can book him for an unforgettable keynote speech under darrenedwardsspeaker.com or connect with him across social media.
Hi, fancy folks. Welcome to Lux Sci, where we make science fun, approachable, and most of all, fancy. I'm Dr. Lex, former microbiologist, current global health consultant, and enthusiast of all the finer things in life. I'm often joined here by my husband, electrical engineer, inventor, and our audio engineer, Dr. Demos. In this podcast, we take listeners on a journey into the microscopic worlds of luxury items and unravel the fascinating intersection of science and opulence. From how bubbles form in champagne, to the molecular forces that harden clay in a kiln, to the amount of thrust needed to send a rocket to space. No luxurious topic is safe from our insatiable curiosity. We're on a mission to demystify science and show how it drives the world around us. No PhD or lab coat required. So if you've ever wondered how science and luxury seamlessly intertwine, join us as we uncover untold stories, hidden marvels, and the inner workings of scientific discovery and sophistication. Along the way, we'll also chat with amazing scientists and artisans, so subscribe now and let the exploration begin.